The first moment I encountered Martha Higgins, she was blocking a narrow forest path, dressed in a high-vis neon vest and gripping a clipboard, insisting I register before continuing on to my own cabin. Within a week, she had already scheduled an HOA vote to have me removed from the property. What she didn't realize was that I had recently purchased the entire stretch of forest she believed she controlled. My name is Arthur Vance, and at 44 years old, I had eventually made my dream a reality, owning a vast expanse of untouched wilderness. It covered 1,200 acres of pine and cedar in Silverleaf Highlands, along with a weather cabin I'd been restoring for the last month. I work as a wildlife photographer with some contracting work on the side, and I picked this place deliberately for its total seclusion. The closest town was a half-hour drive away, and that suited me perfectly. What I hadn't anticipated was Martha Higgins, HOA president of Oakage Vacation Community, self-appointed forest authority and unofficial ruler of everything within a 5-mile circle. Oakage consisted of roughly 40 vacation cabins tucked into what used to be the southern edge of the forest. The development had existed for about 15 years, and apparently Martha had been governing it like her personal empire for 7. I had noticed the community during my property inspection, a tidy cluster of identical cabins painted in HOA-approved brown, with matching green shutters. Technically, they were my neighbors, even though the closest cabin was still about half a mile from mine. The problems began just 3 days after I arrived. I was clearing fallen branches near my cabin when I heard the sharp noise of someone clearing their throat behind me. I turned around to see a woman in her late 50s wearing what looked like a homemade park ranger outfit she had likely ordered online. She carried a clipboard, a whistle hanging from her neck, and an expression like she had just caught someone committing a serious offense. In a sharp, high-pitched tone, she declared that I had violated HOA Rule 7.3, unauthorized forestry activity. I calmly explained that I wasn't part of any HOA, that this was private land, and that I was simply clearing fallen branches. She dismissed it immediately, insisting that every property in the Silverleaf region fell under Oakage HOA control. When I laughed at the claim, genuinely laughed, her face turned deep red. She demanded to inspect my deed and a permit for tree removal. I told her, barely hiding my amusement, that I didn't need permission to pick up sticks on my own property. She quickly scribbled notes on her clipboard and said I would be hearing from the HOA board. I wished her a nice day and returned to my work, assuming that would be the end of it. I was mistaken. Over the next several days, 3 official-looking notices were taped to trees along my driveway. The first accused me of unauthorized removal of natural debris. The second cited me for damaging trail aesthetics, which apparently meant relocating a fallen log off the path. The third, and this one was truly absurd, accused me of installing unapproved birdhouses. I had placed exactly 2 birdhouses near my cabin on my own land for my own use. Each notice escalated in tone, threatening fines, legal consequences, and immediate cessation of all activities. They were all signed by Martha Higgins, president, stamped with an official-looking HOA seal I was fairly sure she had printed herself. The letterhead listed her as president, secretary, treasurer, and compliance officer, which told me exactly what kind of operation this HOA was running. Things escalated further when I found her on my property taking photos of my firewood stack. I was inside brewing coffee when I noticed her through the window, creeping around like a suburban investigator, photographing my stack logs from multiple angles. When I stepped outside to confront her, she claimed she was gathering evidence of unauthorized construction, a woodpile. According to her interpretation of HOA regulations, it counted as an unapproved outdoor storage structure. I told her to get off my property or I would call the sheriff. She huffed and replied that the sheriff was a personal friend who fully supported the HOA's efforts to maintain order in the community. Then she shoved another notice into my hand. This one was printed on bright pink paper, what she called an extreme urgency citation. It was a formal summons to appear before the HOA board at their next meeting to answer for my multiple violations. The meeting was set for Thursday at 7 p.m. in the Oakage Community Center, which turned out to be nothing more than a converted double-wide trailer with wood paneling and flickering fluorescent lights. I decided I would attend, but not for the reasons Martha expected. Over the next 3 days before the meeting, I did my own digging. First, I went to the county courthouse and requested all property records for the area. What I discovered was very interesting. The Oakage HOA only had legal authority over the 43 properties inside their official development. Their jurisdiction ended exactly at their property boundaries, clearly marked on government survey maps. My land, every one of its 1,200 acres, was completely separate and had never been included in any HOA agreement. But here's where things became even more interesting. I hired a licensed surveyor to recheck my boundaries, paying extra for an expedited survey. The surveyor, a man named Greg, who had been working in the field for 30 years, found something that made him shake his head and whistle under his breath. The Oakage HOA had quietly extended their walking trails onto my land, not just slightly over the line, but in some places nearly 300 yards deep into my property. The most blatant violation was their community gazebo, a large wooden structure they had built years ago for weddings and events. It was sitting right in the middle of what was legally my forest. Greg documented everything carefully with GPS data, official markers, and enough legal evidence to make any attorney very interested. Thursday evening arrived, and I stepped into that community center carrying a rolled-up survey map under my arm and a thick folder of documents. The room was packed with around 30 residents, all watching me with a mix of curiosity and hostility. Martha sat at a folding table in the front, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. She called the meeting to order with an actual gavel, striking it far too hard. In her most self-important voice, she announced that they were there to address the matter of Mr. Vance's violations and his refusal to comply with HOA standards. Several residents nodded along, clearly accustomed to this kind of performance. As she called me forward to defend myself, I stood up slowly and walked to the front. I could already see the smug satisfaction on her face, as if she were preparing to make an example out of me. I calmly asked if I could present some documentation to the board. She waved her hand dismissively, saying I could present whatever excuses I wanted, but the violations were obvious. That was when I unrolled the survey map, 3 feet by 4 feet, and pinned it to the wall behind her. The room went completely silent. As people leaned forward to see what I had brought, I pulled out a laser pointer, a dramatic touch I prepared, and began my presentation. I explained calmly that I was Arthur Vance, the owner of 1,200 acres of forest surrounding Oak Ridge. I showed them exactly where my property boundaries were, highlighting them in green. Then I marked where the HOA land ended, outlined clearly in red. The gap between them was large and undeniable. Martha stammered that this was impossible, insisting the HOA had always maintained those areas. I then produced the next document, the original HOA charter from 15 years earlier, which clearly defined their limits. After that, I presented my warranty deed, which predated their development by half a century, but I still wasn't finished. I pointed out the 3 walking trails that crossed onto my land, marking each place where they trespassed. I showed photographs Greg had taken of HOA signs, benches, and markers placed illegally inside my property. Then I indicated the gazebo, the structure they were so proud of, sitting more than 400 feet inside my legal boundary. The room exploded. Residents shouted questions over one another. Martha slammed her gavel repeatedly, while the other board members scrambled through their papers. One man in the crowd asked loudly how something like this could have happened. I explained that the previous owner of my land, an elderly woman living out of state, had never even been aware of the encroachment. She had inherited the property from her father and never once visited it. Martha tried to push back, bringing up adverse possession and long-term use, throwing around legal phrases she had clearly looked up online. That was when I produced my final document, a letter from my attorney, a highly experienced woman named Sarah Jenkins who specialized in property disputes. The letter laid everything out in very clear language. The HOA had been trespassing for years. Adverse possession did not apply due to lack of open and notorious use. Requirements, and I was fully prepared to pursue immediate legal action. I informed the entire room that effective immediately, all HOA members were banned from my property. The walking trails would be closed, the gazebo would be removed, and anyone caught trespassing would face prosecution. I gave them a strict 72-hour window to remove any personal belongings from the gazebo before my contractors arrived. The meeting quickly spiraled into chaos. Martha tried shouting over everyone, threatening lawsuits and injunctions, but even some of her supporters were now questioning her. One woman loudly asked why Martha had never confirmed the property boundaries before building the gazebo. Another demanded to know how much HOA money had been spent on structures built on land they did not own. I walked out while they were still arguing, but not before placing my first no trespassing sign on the community center door, clearly marking where my property began. It was petty, but after weeks of harassment, I felt entitled to a bit of theater. The next morning, I had a crew installing heavy gates across all 3 trails that cut into my land, solid metal barriers with locks, and additional no trespassing signs. I also set up security cameras, partly for legal protection and partly because I knew Martha would try something else. And she did. That afternoon she arrived with the sheriff, a tired-looking deputy named Miller, who clearly did not want to be involved. She demanded he arrest me for stealing HOA property and violating easement rights. Deputy Miller examined my documents and survey markers, then told Martha in a tired voice that I was well within my legal rights and she needed to stop calling emergency services over civil disputes. The gazebo removal was set for Monday. I hired professional crew that specialized in dismantling and relocating structures, even offering the HOA the option to pay to move it onto their own land. They refused, most likely because the estimate came in at $18,000. So instead, the structure was carefully taken apart, and it would stack neatly at the boundary line for them to collect. Martha made one last desperate move, filing an emergency injunction late Friday. The judge dismissed it first thing Monday morning, according to the court clerk, who later called me. The judge actually laughed at her claim that I was stealing community property by enforcing my own land rights. Meanwhile, the Oak Ridge Community Facebook group, which had been quietly following the situation, erupted into chaos. Posts swung between anger over lost hiking paths and open demands for Martha's resignation. Someone leaked that the HOA had spent around $40,000 over the years on trail maintenance and a gazebo on land they didn't even own. Calls for accountability spread rapidly. The final blow came when it was revealed that Martha had been collecting a monthly forest maintenance fee from residents for 5 years, supposedly for upkeep of trails and communal structures, that totaled nearly $30,000 for maintaining land that legally belonged to someone else. The word embezzlement began circulating, and Martha suddenly stopped responding to messages. An emergency HOA board meeting was called for the following week. I didn't attend, but I heard everything from Greg, the surveyor, whose cousin lived in Oak Ridge. According to him, Martha tried to defend herself for about 10 minutes before a motion of no confidence was introduced. It passed unanimously. Even the 2 board members who had supported her at my meeting voted her out, but the consequences didn't end there. The HOA's insurance provider opened an investigation into financial misconduct, and the state attorney general's office launched a fraud inquiry based on resident complaints. Martha was forced to hire a criminal defense attorney, which reportedly cost her $15,000 just as a retainer. The investigation uncovered years of misused funds, with HOA money being spent on personal expenses disguised as community improvements. A forensic accountant later found receipts for a private hot tub labeled as gazebo heating equipment and a Florida vacation listed as a forestry management conference. In the end, Martha Higgins was charged with fraud and embezzlement. She pleaded guilty to avoid prison time, but received 5 years of probation and was ordered to repay $58,000 in restitution. When the judge read the sentence, She collapsed into her seat, sobbing that her life was ruined.